Well, welcome to our second instalment of the Based podcast with Alex Antic. I'm really excited today. Our guest is former SA Senator Cory Bernardi, formerly of the Liberal Party, then founding his own party, Australian Conservatives, after that. And one thing people will never say about Cory is that he backed away from fights in relation to the culture wars, fights in relation to energy policy. He was a very early adopter on the push for nuclear power, fights against the rising issue of the Chinese Communist Party, you name it. Cory was an early adopter on it and in many ways paid the price politically, I think, for it. But he's a brave voice and still is a brave voice today, someone who still through the media continues to fight for common sense. It's a great privilege to have former SA Senator Cory Bernadi with us today. Here we are. Welcome, Cory Bernadi, former Senator.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes.
Or can I call you Alex?
No, I'd prefer you just... No, of course.
Yes,
Of course. It's good to have you here. Good to have you down the road here in Blair Athol, the command centre. And we've given you a bit of a tour and you liked it. You said you'd liked it. You'd like to affirm that.
I think I enjoyed it more when it was a bottle shop.
Yeah, it was. It was more productive. Thank you. I got in quicker. I got in more quickly than you did. I knew I had to jump in. We are currently in the Sauv Blanc section. So this actually probably would have been the cashier, I think. But anyway, we're here and we're recording with this podcast. We're getting interesting guests on. And I think, when it comes to interesting, what a diverse career that you have had. And I want to touch on a few different bits and pieces. But I want you to tell me about the journey to becoming. Were you a firebrand, or were you what were you called? What does the journey look like? Tell me about.
I was called many things, and I'd often say that what the words they called me, whilst they might have started with C, I said Cory's not pronounced like that. It's terrible. I don't know how it happened. I was interested in politics. I got into the Senate. I started to realise there were things that people weren't talking about. And of course, then all of a sudden, you become this lightning rod for dissent. And it was all about climate change at the start, to be honest. We would say that what was proposed for the emissions trading scheme and various other incarnations was crazy. We were fighting an internal battle about it. But there was only a handful of us that would talk about it at the time. And of course, when that battle was won with the internal Liberal fight, or temporarily won, a lot of the others moved on and sort of said, oh, well, no, there's nothing else, no more dragons to slay. I found a dragon under every rock and I kept trying to slay them. And I remember being cautioned by one of my mates in the parliamentary party, he's no longer there, and said, oh, you've got to be careful of your brand. And I thought, I don't have a brand. I'm just here talking about the things that the Liberals should be talking about. Yep. And I was admonished for standing up in the party room and saying, we're meant to be the party of lower taxes. Why are you putting them up? Have you thought about, this issue or that issue? And anyway, it became the lightning rod for dissent and trouble. And I thought I might as well live up to my reputation.
Well, once you're halfway on the journey, you might as well get to the destination, I suppose. And I can tell you, there are a lot of us out there, and I'm sure you still get this. A lot of us out there that relish that. I have to say, from it was one of the things that I saw from afar and thought, well, if that guy can get out there and speak, we all need to get out there and say something. I mean, it was a bit of an inspiration.
Well, I'll say thank you for that, but I don't look at it like that myself. I merely thought, if I'm not prepared to do it, right, and I had nothing to lose. I was in politics. I always knew I was going to leave at a certain time. I wanted to change the world. I wasn't successful, but that's not the point. If I went there and didn't do the things I thought I would be desperately unfulfilled. And I said this to my wife when I was contemplating leaving the Liberal Party. We were overseas and I said, I can leave politics, I can leave the Liberal Party and start my own party. I don't really know. And she said, if you don't give it a go, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. And she was right. I have no regrets about it, but she's absolutely right. That's my nature. If I don't do something that I think I'm going to do, I should be doing, I'll have regrets.
Yeah, and it is like that, isn't it? I mean, I know exactly what you mean. Someone, I think who would be very comfortable sharing in this room worldview said to me once, there are lots of things you can do in life, but it's very rare you get afforded the privilege, and it is a privilege to be sitting in our federal parliament or any of the parliaments. What is the point of sitting there and not fighting for something you believe in? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, just think about some of your colleagues, right? Left, right, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
A lot of them just plod along and go through the machinery of government, right? Yes, they do their committee work and they say, oh, we should be improving this or something, but they let so much go through the truly substantive stuff. And, kudos to you. You were one of the few during that pandemic that started to talk about the values and the principles and the potential lies and dishonesty that was creeping into the system. But how could so many people within the so-called Freedom Party, the Liberal Party, the party of individual choice and business and respect for property rights, how could so many of them remain silent over such an egregious abuse of our civil liberties, of government overreach? It beggars belief. And that's when, to be honest, they lost me completely.
I mean, just to play a bit of defence on some of the people, I know many that had the views that we have on that subject, but many in certain respects couldn't fathom the gravity of what was happening, I think. So for the better purpose of it, I think sometimes it does take people that are prepared to, swing the axe a bit to get out there.
Am I allowed to call bullshit on that?
Yeah,
can we swear on this podcast?
You can now. That's the first one, though, by the way.
I'm calling BS on that because I've heard this stuff so many times, right, where people would come to me when I was in politics and my colleagues, yeah, you should do something about this. Well, why don't you do something about it? Oh, I can't. And it's because they've got a career or they're frightened of stepping out of the net. I had one bloke who was a shadow parliamentary secretary for, basket weaving or something, who when Rudd was proposing to have this constitutional referendum on local government recognition, he said, this is the single thing that I got into Parliament to do, to stop this sort of idiotic thing. But he wasn't there voting against the referendum provisions in the Parliament because he couldn't, because he had a position to protect. I mean, that's the sort of cowardice. Their whole life is devoted to one thing, but they won't do it.
I will agree with you on this point. I think that politics is about what you do, not what you say, isn't it? And so we see that with the likes of, and I'm a bit sceptical about Ron DeSantis, I've got to say, in many respects. But you got to pay the track record. It's pretty good. It
is pretty good, but so's Trump's, right? I mean, Trump is like us all. He's a flawed character, but by crikey, he has belled the cat on a lot of the issues. Yeah. Energy issues, the Putin war, the Ukraine, the corruption of the swamp over there.
Yeah.
I can overlook a lot of the flaws because he's right on so many things.
And I think people should have too. I mean, the fact that he's abusive on Twitter or was, surely is a secondary concern to people as to whether or not they can feed themselves.
He got me onto Twitter.
Yeah,
so he was an inspiration. Yeah. Maybe that's unwise. But
no, it's been very good. I follow your feed quite religiously. This is because, of course, we're turning the tables on this now, which is feeling I'm quite liberated by the fact that I can now ask you questions and go for that. I want what people don't know about you is, and I'm sure you'd be very willing to tell us, is that that you were a very, very accomplished athlete in your day. You represented Australia in rowing.
I did.
1989. Yeah. Coxless 4. Am I right?
The World Champs, yeah.
The World Champs,
we did a lesser crew the year before, but I'm not sure I was that good an athlete. I could stick at something that was quite hard, and that's one of the challenges.
Sure, I like this humble version. Just go and talk it up. I want to hear it because it's true. You genuinely did.
Okay, here's the truth. The truth is we went to the World Championships in the Coxless 4 in 1989. We finished, I think it was 9th or 10th in the world. I was 18. I was just a young kid. Next year, I hurt my back. I wasn't in the crew. They won the World Championships, so I was the weakest link. Yeah. they would never have won. They would never have won the World Championships or the Olympic gold medals subsequent with me in the crew.
It was a Coxless 4 plus anchor,
and there should be some sort of plaque or some sort of statue. So without this bloke getting injured, Olympic glory would never have been ours.
That's right.
Do I get any thanks for that, Alex?
There is a famous story of the Crows trading a player to get Darren Jarman back, and he now credits himself for being the premiership linchpin. It's a bit like, which is fine.
I can identify that.
I don't think that's right. I think you're underselling it quite dramatically. You went off and did a bit of time overseas, travelling like kids do at that stage, and you went to Europe?
Yeah, I was. I guess I was a little bit lost. Didn't know what I wanted to do because I originally thought I wanted to be an athlete. I wanted to go to the Olympics and do that sort of stuff. So that stuff's taken away from you. Hated university. Didn't have any respect for the lecturers or the drug-addled students that were there.
I'm shocked.
So I didn't last that long at uni. And so I went overseas and started working and contracting, and we went to some really interesting places, like into the Eastern Bloc, through Northern Africa, places where we were working for a German company doing events, and wherever the Germans didn't want to go, they'd send the Aussie adventurers. And
like Albie Mangles.
We had some adventures, let me tell you, and it was a great time. We were well paid, learned a lot of stuff I probably wouldn't repeat, but it was incredible.
What about, you told me once a story about during that promotional period going out and officiating at a golf tournament. You know, you're the bloke that holds up the quiet sign.
No, I wasn't the guy that did the quiet sign. We went and built the village for the golf tournament, and so we'd follow the what was the Volvo Masters then. It was a European circuit. We'd follow that around and build these villages, and so we'd have adventures in different places. But the story you're thinking of, we were in Valderrama in Spain. It was the Ryder Cup, some serious thing, whatever it was. And there was a playoff hole, and on the last day, Colin Montgomery versus some other bloke.
Tell us about Colin Montgomery.
He's my new friend. Anyway, this is 25 years ago. A playoff hole, everyone's quiet around the thing, and I'm standing there watching because I was on duty, and he's halfway through his backswing, and my radio goes off, goes crack, crack, crack. And so he shanks it into the woods. The whole of Europe turns around and looks at me. I turn around and start walking away in shame. And the company I was working for was on the back of my jacket. And so that went broadcast. It was broadcast right around Europe and across the world. And I got into trouble by the owner of the golf course, who was a guy named Jimmy Patino, who was a multi-billionaire tin magnate who's dead now. But apparently the owner of the firm, this German guy, was delighted about the publicity that his company got. So it's kind of like that the boy in a dress charity that I condemned, and they raised something like $1 multi-million donations from the gay community to protest me. Similar thing.
Well, you're a philanthropist. I knew it. I knew you were an activist in some way. I'll have to go looking for that footage. It must be out there somewhere. A young Bernardi getting Montgomery angry. It's a different world now than it was then. But you were one of the people, and I say this quite genuinely, who was well ahead of the Overton window on politics, which, for people who don't know that term, there's a political theory that the Overton window is like a sliding ruler, and people eventually catch up, the public eventually catches up, but at one point the ruler is miles to one side of the coin, and you are radical. The concepts are radical, and slowly people become acclimatized to them and they become mainstream. You have found yourself sitting, if not outside the Overton window, then certainly, outside of the Overton window, but being right in many respects.
Galaxy
some in a different orbit. It sort of raises the issue, though, doesn't it, about this concept of, I heard someone talking about it today, the new left versus the old left. It's a strange set of circumstances. When I think of the old left of politics 40 years ago, I think of, the Labor Party standing for working rights, and we don't have that anymore. We've now got a sort of a militant, ground-taking, so-called progressive movement that just wants the next line on the battlefield, doesn't it?
I think you're right that things have changed substantially, but the old left were always quite militant as well. If you think about some of the people I was in the Senate with, and people I genuinely like Doug Cameron, hard left Scotsman, would always had a really good turn of phrase, could always give an impassioned speech on behalf of the workers, and was very, very proud of the fact that he started on I think a steel mill or a shipyard or something like that, and rose through the ranks, became a senator in Australia. He should be proud of that, even though we disagreed on almost everything. Had a good sense of humour. Then the left became about identity politics.
Well, that's the point,
and that's changed everything. And the crazy thing about it is they want everyone to break down into these little silos of identity. And yet at the same time, they say you can change your identity whenever you like. You can identify as whatever you want to be. And they expect society to suspend biology, common sense, accuracy, truth, to indulge you in whatever whim you're going along with.
So that's the point. The old left, deal with, and you're right about the militant side of it. They were fighting their case, pushing their case, which you expect them to do. But they were doing so from a general framework of sort of traditional
capital versus Labor stuff. That was what traditional.
That was the battlefront at that point. Now it seems intent upon destroying the family unit, breaking into identity groups, as you say, and pushing, I would say, and you probably would agree, I think, interests that aren't necessarily Australian national interests. So they've become globalists rather than nationalists.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting thing, that things have turned on their end. We've got 180 degrees. It used to be the right that were accused of, being globalists because we believed in free trade, because we believed in, cooperation between countries and things of that nature. Now the left are talking about global governance. Right? And people say, oh, that's a myth, it's a conspiracy theory. Bob Brown in the Senate, not in the Senate, he gave a speech about fellow Earthians, and he wanted one world government where, every person had a vote. Well, might as well hand it over to China and India and the Africans and let them decide what happens to the world. This is where the left are now. They used to preach against racism. They call everyone else a racist. But we've got the left that are now pushing the most racist provision I've ever heard of in this country with The Voice. I mean, it's dividing people according to race and giving you a set of entitlements. It's a baby step towards apartheid. You've got them saying, where Martin Luther King, who was part of the left, used to say, it's the content of your character, not the colour of your skin. Now we're saying it's actually the colour of your skin that matters. This is the crazy mixed up world that we live in. And I no longer want to even indulge in it. I just want to call it out as being preposterous. It's crazy. I think someone has to do it. And you've got to laugh at them and just go, nothing they do anymore is consistent. It's not based on principle. It is just a licorice, all sorts of garbage.
And I think you're right about the parody. I think parody is so powerful when you're dealing with this sort of nonsense like you've just spoken about. Sometimes it gets lamented that you're not taking the job seriously or whatever. But how do you not parody some of this stuff? Well, I mean, it's the most powerful weapon, isn't it?
You've got to take your job seriously, but you can't take yourself too seriously. But how can you take their stuff seriously? How can you take the sorts of stuff they're pushing seriously? It's anti-racist to enact racist provisions. Right? It just doesn't make any sense. When you how is it all of a sudden that, we go back to this gender stuff. How do we have multiple genders all of a sudden? And we're meant to pretend that's okay. How do we have it that it's all right for some bloke who wears, some horse mask to be, a senior bureaucrat under the Biden administration? How is it that anyone can defend? How is it you can have Biden as the president of the United States and people say he's a sentient being? It's just it beggars belief.
It wasn't only that though. You were front and centre on one of the early adopters on the climate scepticism, we would say, but it'd be fair enough to say that. You were one of the few that was asking questions about.
Well, I wrote an essay. It was my first apology, I think. I remember ringing Alexander Downer as a way of getting to the Prime Minister. In 2009, I wrote an essay, Cool Heads Needed on Global Warming, which then turned into an advertiser headline, your favourite thing. Lib declares climate war or something like that. So it was me declaring war against the climate. Yeah. And nothing's changed. It is. We are being sold a bunch of bunkum. Every prediction has failed to come true. The data, the statistics are skewed. It is just garbage. Climate change is a natural phenomenon. We can be better stewards of the environment, but should we deny ourselves affordable, reliable, dispatchable electricity for the sake of some greenies who hate humanity? The answer is no.
I mean, people need to hear that more often, I think, don't they? I mean, because there are a certain number of similar factors from that movement to the COVID period we've just been through, I think, aren't they? There is a lot of...
Well, the commonality is control.
It exactly took the words out of my mouth. It's all about control, isn't it?
Yeah, this has been traditionally that the right has been about individual autonomy, and the left have been more authoritarian. Now, some people will argue about that, and the horseshoe of politics comes together at times. But in essence, now I see government as a much more dangerous beast than it's ever been before, because they have an insatiable thirst for power. They want more influence and control over individual lives. We used to have some bailiwicks bulwarks to stand against it. The media used to be a big part of it. Now there is much complicit in it. We used to have individuals of strength and character that would go in there and fight for the things that mattered. You could go back to John Hyde and a bunch of the drives, about about economic reform and protectionism was bad. We had people of real character that would go in and do some stuff. Now, and I come back to this COVID thing, most of your colleagues remain silent, with some notable exceptions, right? But most of them remain silent on the public scale because they wanted someone else to do the heavy lifting. You did it, a few others did it, but it's cowardice.
So where does it come from? I mean, I always say this is a long march through the institutions, but things, the left have pushed and pushed and pushed to the point where they are almost the establishment now. How has it happened? Where has it come from?
I think they are the establishment. I mean, we're the radicals now.
The outliers.
And I wrote that book, The Conservative Revolution.
Which I read.
And people complained about the term revolution, but what they did.
I think I've got a rare unsigned copy of that.
Oh,
it's worth
the unsigned copy.
Just a little joke.
What people don't understand is that the revolution was not, a guns and blood revolution, but things are so entrenched on the left that you need to have this overthrow of the existing order in order to restore some balance. So how's it happened? Well, I think those on the right of politics bear the responsibility for the simple reason that, and I'm guilty of this as well, some of the things that were put forward by the radical left over the years were so crazy that people like me would go, you don't have to worry about that. That will never catch on. We'll let that go. There's bigger dragons to slay. But all the time, they're infiltrating the institutions, the media, the education system, getting into politics, that would take over, and that voice would be given some legitimacy. And so we never nipped it in the bud when it should have been and dismissed it straight away. And so all of a sudden it became normal to hear that, and people started to accept it. And most people are quite apathetic and are followers. We saw that during COVID. And every time someone like me or you would push back against these things, we were then dismissed as the cranks and, what are they getting upset about? It's just a different point of view. Don't you believe in freedom of speech? People would never recognise how dangerous the ideas that were coming through were. So we didn't fight hard enough. And leadership on our side of politics and in other institutions were weak.
It is the case, isn't it, that the vast majority of people out there are conservatives in the old sense, I think, quiet Australians. Yeah. I think most people are, who have been the better part of the last 50 years or more, raising families, running businesses with better things to do, where the left have fought. They've fought hard to infiltrate every institution. It's why now schools are teaching kids stuff that we're all appalled by. It's why the media is now, those kids have come through into the university system, been trained, and they're now captains of industry. And this long march is on. And, it really does take, I think, people becoming aware of the fact that we have dropped the ball and that, the left's been creeping while we've been sleeping. And, what's the wake-up point, do you think, for the masses? People are still going through it.
Okay. So, and this is where I think a lot of conservatives will have different views. My view is one which I read about, I can't recall the book, it was about a decade ago, and I thought it was wrong. It was called The Last Conservatism. I can't remember who the author was. But in essence, they argued the battle had been lost and that it was up to conservatives to build their moat around themselves, whether it be for their family, individually, their family, or a community, where you might get, and particularly more in America, where groups of people who have similar views might gravitate towards a suburb and want to use similar stores and make sure they're catering to the people who have those views. It was like building your little eco-community of old, but for conservatives. I've actually come around to that point of view now. I don't think we can radically change where the world is heading, the trajectory right now. I think we've got to prepare for the inevitable result of it, which is going to be dysfunction, it's going to be despair, it's going to be financial issues for people. So how can you do that for yourself and your family is up to every individual to decide, but we will then have a role to rebuild, because the facade, the edifice is crumbling, right? And society is deconstructing, it's more divided than ever before. The welfare state, which has been peddled by the left and right of politics, is collapsing. I think conflict is growing right around the world, and the economic consequences of that will be felt, and people will go, hang on, the lies we've been told, we've had enough. Now, that could happen in the next decade, and I think people need to prepare themselves for that.
And we're seeing this in a lot of US cities, aren't we, where the Democrats have had a grapple hold for decades, if not the last decade. You know, San Francisco, Los Angeles, that are now just falling into disarray after years of mismanagement, of all the sorts of things you've just spoken about there. I mean, let's hope we don't have to go through all of that, but, you know, I think the cracks are starting to show.
Well, think about it. I mean, the world is so indebted. They need some inflation, right, which has been kicking along. Interest rates are making life very difficult for individuals who are in debt. Governments have unsustainable pension promises that are going along. Europe is effectively bankrupt. They're trying to tinker with our superannuation system here, which they keep promising every election they never will. Finance is going to be the stumbling block. And if you don't have the things that power a decent economy, which are small businesses, reliable electricity and jobs for people, you're going to have some sort of rebellion. And one of the axes that I think is most disturbing now, we've got big government teaming up with big business. Remember, they used to be opposed to each other. Big government, big business, they were an antithesis of each other. And the Liberals would always be standing up for smaller government and for businesses to get as big as they possibly could. These two forces are aligned, and they're aligned to keep people dependent on government, so that the way they're on the economic treadmill, and they'll just keep turning up to work in order to sustain themselves. And they want to cut out the opportunity for those of us in the middle class to bring ourselves up by creating businesses and growing. So you've got all these impediments there. And that is
whether by design or by sheer circumstance, that is the net effect of one of the things we've seen out of COVID, isn't it? We've seen, while the local business down the road going broke on the main street, you got Amazon raking in billions, big governments getting bigger, big corporations are getting bigger, and the middle ground are struggling.
Well, I was talking to a mate of mine last night. His son is, I won't tell you what position, but a very senior position in a massive Australian enterprise. And his son might get paid $10 million a year, right? It's a guess, but it's a heck of a lot of money.
Mm.
And he said to me that he can't stand how woke that company is and how woke the executives are and everything else, and including his son. And I said, and he asked, why are they doing it? And I said, well, why wouldn't they? That's their ticket to an entree into government. It's a ticket, an entree into acceptance in society. Do you think any of this wokeness will have any impact on him at all? He's earning $10 million a year. His mansion in X, Y, whatever suburb it is going to be immune to that. He'll still have his holidays. He'll still have his, the corporate jet available to them. These are the things that the people who are pushing this are entirely removed from it.
Mm.
Entirely. It's like the Davos summit.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they fly in on their private jets to tell you about climate change.
Mm.
That you're not allowed to fly to Melbourne to see the footy.
Billionaires telling millionaires how to make the rest of us live.
Yeah,
that's
one. That's exactly right.
So I mean, that was, there's I guess a range of things over the last 2 or 3 years that have been debunked as conspiracy theories, and yet they all seem to be coming true. And if you look down the pipe now, you see things that I know we've spoken about many times before: digital ID, central bank digital currencies. 15-minute cities, smart cities. Are any of these truly conspiracy theories, or are we going to be seeing people saying you're right?
Well, they're all very true, right? They're all very, very accurate in the fact that 15-minute cities is part of an agenda. It's sold as something that's going to benefit, and it's got a seductive air to it.
Mm.
You can walk places. I love it. I live in a relatively small community. I can walk most places most days.
Mm. I knew it.
But part of the
plan.
problem. But it also, by providing these things and by putting in the infrastructure and the surveillance resources that are necessary in order to do it, it also can operate as a golden cage.
Mm.
And why would you facilitate them putting the start of a cage around you? That's how I look at that.
Mm.
You go central bank digital currencies, I think, are the worst possible thing that could happen.
Yeah.
Right? You can always scoop under the net, in Logan's Run type outside of the 15-minute city. But the central bank digital currency is something that they can program it, they can control exactly what you spend it on, they can track where it goes. And that means if whatever your picadillo is. They can say, no, you've had enough, tequila this week. You're not allowed to have any more Big Macs. You've bought too much meat. Whatever it might be, they can program and they can cut you off. And we've seen how Trudeau cut off the people who supported that with a regular currency. Once you're out of unbanked, you're cooked.
You're done.
Yeah. So that's the one that concerns me a heck of a lot. The digital ID one is fascinating because I'm with you in this. I think having to have effectively a license for the internet is extraordinary. But one very smart young bloke mentioned to me the other day, it was about, well, this is the way it's going because you can't rely on any of the information we have. There is so much lies and misinformation and thing out there that with the advent of artificial intelligence, they can take your image, they can make you effectively say anything or give the appearance of saying anything in a digitally altered image, and that can go around the world as a complete lie, destroy your life, destroy your career. We've seen it with people, some people in pornography, we've seen it in people accused of saying different things, and you would know yourself. It's very hard to know what you can rely on on the internet. So there's a digital ID targeted towards saying, well, yes, this is actually genuinely from the person that said it, right? There's an attractiveness to that. Does that outweigh the dangers of having a government issue it?
This is the problem, isn't it?
If it's a government-issued one, I'm absolutely against it. I think it's wrong.
This is the problem with all of these things because in many respects, safety, security and convenience are marketed as the cornerstones and they are very real. You're right. I mean, this will be pitched for those reasons. That is, this will give you security and safety in the same way that surveillance cameras with facial recognition technology do that as well. But the issue is, do we trust government? Do we trust them with the data? Do we trust them with the responsibility? Do we trust them with the bracket creep and the mission creep?
No.
It's got to be no. Yeah. And it doesn't matter who you are and where you come from. We've seen that. And the thing that strikes me as being so incredible is that over the last 2 years, we've seen it. Like we've actually seen the precursors of how that can be mismanaged and misused.
Well, just think of that. What was the scan in when you had to scan in to enter a shop?
Yeah.
That was never going to be misused except by the police when they wanted to use
it for.
Yeah. And the embarrassment of people being asked to show their vaccination papers or status to go into a pub is a disgrace. I mean, it's an embarrassment. And any pub that put up a sign or restaurant, only the vax can come in here, should be ashamed of themselves, and I think they probably are.
Yeah. Well, do you think people now get it, or do you think they've just got on with their business?
No, they don't get it. Those who've swallowed all the propaganda, living in denial, so they will say, "Oh no, we did the right thing." I think most people are just happy it's behind them and will move on, and that's how governments get away with this garbage all the time.
Yeah, we're still seeing that narrative now. We're still seeing that it was all about safety. Vaccination was all about keeping the community safe. We hear it all the time when there's no proof of it. And in fact, just this week, we've had a very, very curious report from the health bureaucrats in this state, a so-called SAMRI report, which seems to support the theory that you're much safer if you've taken the shots, and yet we can't see the original document, the source documents. So
are you going to believe the people that have misled you for such a long time? You can excuse the early part of it, right, where they were flying blind, but towards the end of this pandemic, and it was very aware in the middle of it, they were overstepping every single boundary and every single principle. And I will be critical of the previous government, federal and state, because they knew what they were doing.
Well, I mean, I think you're right about that. The first little period, I think we all agree we didn't know what was coming. But for me, and I said it all the way through, the issue was simply handing over control to bureaucrats. And I think what we've seen over the last little period is the rise of the unelected. I think we've always been there, right? All the way back for, centuries probably, but certainly in the short period, we've seen the bureaucracy, pulling the strings. Yes, Minister, we've seen it. But it feels to me like as their numbers grow, both on a domestic and a world scale, with bodies like the WHO, the bureaucracy is finding a way to circumvent democracy. Well,
look at the European Union. I mean, the politicians go there, the EU, and they talk about it, but the bureaucrats do what they want. The bureaucrats actually make the legislation.
That's right.
and it's just a jab fest. Is that really what we want for this country? And that's what we saw in South Australia. The elected Premier of the state had given his duties across to the Police Commissioner and a health bureau.
This had happened all over the world. I mean, how does that happen? How does it happen that the same projection happens all over the world?
Okay, this is my sense of it, right? That it's all follow the leader. And so you had Dr. Fauci, whose credibility I think has been questioned a number of times. Dr. Fauci was making it up as he goes, would make a range of statements, and that just crept right around the world because it was the risk-averse policy to pursue. And so if he said, we should be double masking, that sort of went to the next stage. And in places like Australia, it was just like, oh yeah, let's go along with that.
But
hence you had Spurrier. If you recall, I think someone asked for the evidence about the 6 feet distancing or the 1.5 metre distancing. And there was no scientific rationale for it at all. It was basically, someone else had done it, and so let's just go with that.
We've asked a heap of questions. We haven't had a response ever to anything. So, I mean, and no one seems to question it. And the newspaper doesn't seem to question it. And once upon a time, the Fourth Estate had a role in that ecosystem of questioning and moving on. People have now moved on to that, which is what I want to get to just next. I know you're an avid follower on Twitter of independent media, as well as obviously having a role with Sky. But it seems to me that there is a future for brave independent journalism. We've seen it recently with I forget his name now, the 85-year-old journalist that dropped the story about Nord Stream. Hirsch, yeah. Seymour Hirsch, the one. We've seen it with a lot of commentators that are now finding a way to get around the corporate media behemoth, which simply has dropped the ball, I think, across the board. What is the future of... There's always going to be a role for journalism. It has to be. If we have to have a strong journalist or journal or what does it look like in the future? And how do people get real news that can be trusted? Because the problem, I think, has been people understood that they've been lied to for 2 years, just using the last couple of years as a framework, and have looked for answers elsewhere. And as a natural result of that, have chased rabbits down rabbit holes that are completely nonsensical.
Yeah, and it comes back to this thing, you don't know what's true anymore and what's not. And it's unfortunate that a lot of the mastheads which we relied on historically, both in print and in digital media, have either through omission or through submission have not perhaps told the full story. And I really lament that. But it's a huge challenge. I'm not quite sure how it's going to change, because a lot of the people that I like to listen to are formulating ideas based on on the evidence that's before them, and then applying their intelligence, their experience, their investigative powers to draw a different conclusion than you might otherwise get. I like that as journalism because it is opinion-based and it's supported by some facts. But it doesn't mean they're right all the time.
That's right.
So you've got to have this competing viewpoint, and we don't have that anymore. The ABC don't have competing viewpoints. No. SBS doesn't have it. I mean, we try on Sky. I like the fact that they want to have a debate and discussion about stuff. Now, I think that's really quite healthy. We see that in the Australian newspaper more often. You get a commentary that's there to stimulate debate and discussion, but we don't see it in any substantive form across the world.
And part of the problem, I think, is that journalists had the infrastructure around them to allow them to do their job once upon a time, chase the story. So you had the money, the time, the equipment to go off and say, right, well, I've got to chase that document and I've got to get it. How does the independent journalist do that when it's just somebody in a laptop? They've probably got another job, or they...
Well, but this is a fascinating thing. They do. People like Alex Berenson, who is a journalist, has a Substack which is extraordinarily popular and exposed a heck of a lot about COVID, for example. I follow a lot of people in that space that have independent means, and they're making more money than they would as a journalist because people are subscribing. I have my own website, of course, and it's a subscriber website, so I like to interpret events through my lens. It doesn't mean that everyone agrees with me on that site, but it provokes them. It provokes thought from their point of view, and it means that they're viewing something through a different filter than perhaps otherwise they would receive if they didn't follow my.
That's right.
And I think that's quite healthy.
Yeah.
But I don't know where it's going to end. What I'm deeply concerned about is, quite frankly, the ability that's coming through this AI is to create entire fictions and make them seem reasonable. I think we're seeing that a lot with the Ukraine-Russia war. I think a lot of what's been presented in that is completely non-credible in respect to some of the footage and vision, and it's been discredited along the way.
I've seen a lot of it.
Yeah, but it gets discredited after it's gone around the world.
We've seen gaming footage from games like Call of Duty being put up as credible footage early on and circulating on Twitter. And as you say, once it's out there, people have formed a view.
People accept it, and you can't ever correct the ledger. There's never the equivalent campaign to suggest, no, this was misinformation or lies, because it's all designed to suit a purpose. And, you know, there was that video of the president of Ukraine from late at night when that circulated for a day or two before it disappeared mysteriously off the internet, because it didn't suit the narrative that was that, you know, this is a really great world leader that's saving us. He's Winston Churchill reincarnated.
Why is no one talking about peace in the Ukraine? Right? Why is the West not pushing for peace? There was a peace deal on the table originally. What happened?
Apparently, well, I'm told that the UK and US said no to it. I think there's a lot of people that have this historical antipathy towards Russia, and they don't like Putin in particular. I get accused of being a Putin sympathiser all the time, right? And that's not the case. The fact is, I can understand why Russia had concerns about what was happening in parts of East Ukraine, and hence the Minsk agreement from 2014, I think, would have, if it had been allowed to happen, like a vote for separation, if that was the case, that would have alleviated a lot of the potential problems. He was goaded into doing what he did. It was unwise, whatever. But that's happened. That's a matter of record now. Anyone that thinks he's just going to walk away from it, like Joe Biden walked away from Afghanistan, I think is fooling themselves. The West will say that Putin is a madman and is continuing to threaten with nuclear weapons, and yet they seem to want to push him to a defeat, which is basically pushing him to use nuclear weapons. So how can they have it both ways? You've got this madman who's going to destroy the world, and the only way to do it is to make it so bad for him that he's got no outlet. So people like Kissinger, very early in the piece, I was very early in the piece, saying, we've got to, I'm not putting myself in the same realm as Kissinger, but the fact is, what's done is done. How do you propose not to have it escalate into World War III?
Yeah.
And we are seeing next to no one talking about that stuff. I mean, just think about this for a second. A missile hit Poland. It was a Ukrainian missile, right? And Zelensky tried to tell the world that it was Putin that did it, and so NATO should launch an offensive against Moscow, right? That's not the language of peace or anything else. It's absolute BS, and it was designed to inflame the situation. You've got hundreds of billions of dollars at stake here, right? You've got corruption, you've got a whole range of things. And I think the West is happy to use this to try and destroy Russia, to have regime change in Russia. And what they haven't thought about is, if Putin's not there, there's some really hard people behind him. Who's going to replace it? Remember, they did this with Gaddafi. I worked in Libya for a while, and he wasn't a good guy. But Libya's in probably a worse state now than it was then.
Open air slave markets.
You've got to think about what happens in the absence of the vacuum, and I have serious concerns about the global geopolitics of the world now, because you've got China, Russia, I think Iran, Saudi Arabia are now the biggest trading partner with China because of the oil. You've got, and even India is sort of sitting on the fence. You've got the big populaces, they're nuclear countries except for Saudi, but they've got huge resources. You've got the declining West because they're surrendering to pronouns and we'll fight you with our rainbows and stuff like this. It's nonsensical, and they don't have the will for it. Do you really think the Western world is going to want to send their men and women and their children off to fight a war over the Ukraine? I don't think so. I don't want to see that. But do you reckon China will be happy to send their million troops? They will. Do you think the Russians really are that enamoured with it? They're not as weak and as soft as we've become in the West. And I don't want to see this. I don't want to see it happen. But how are we going to stop it? And the only way you can stop it is to have a negotiated settlement.
There's got to be a way.
It has to be.
Well, Cory Bernardi, thank you. Thank you for coming in. We could talk for hours. I could. I think it's fascinating. And there's so much stuff that gets left unsaid. But thank you for coming in. Thank you for blazing a trail for others. And hopefully we can continue to see people questioning more and more and more as we get them through Parliament. And congratulations. Keep up the good work and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you. I should say thank you to you too, because mate, you are doing a mighty job in Canberra and right across the country.
I'm just one angry man, one loudmouth, and we've developed a crowd of protesters out the front here now. They've come to see you, so that's not true. That's completely made up, but I just thought I'd throw it in there anyway for humour, and it felt fun.
They were the days when it was important enough to have protesters. No one cares anymore.
Good stuff. Thanks, Cory.
Thanks, Alex.